It's a great honor to be here and to speak to you, and even greater honor to speak after Professor Moltmann, and also to have this first attempt to somehow overview the project. This very deep, very interesting project that started thanks to Katja and Frank's efforts here since a couple of years. So there have been lots of stuff done, and my task is overview all these major topics and themes that we were talking about, we were discussing, and the topics of research since this project started. You see that the topic of the entire project is theology after Gulag, and this is really a huge task. And there was no such thing so far, and we haven't created it so far. There is no some kind of theology after Gulag that we have even dared to create, started to create. But we should think, first of all, what it is to theologize about Gulag. And the task definitely refers to the ultimate questions that Katja listed in her introduction today. The ultimate questions that Professor Moltmann was also reflecting upon. As in one of the papers, one of the first papers that are published, all the papers, by the way, are published on the website of the project, so you can check and look through them and read them. As participants of the project, Beglov and Chukovskaya, who are not present here, unfortunately, wrote in their paper, The Trauma of the Gulag. The trauma of the Gulag questioned the goodness of the human nature. Of course, we can continue and saying that the traumas of the 20th century have inevitably questioned the divine nature, as we just were listening or heard from Professor Moltmann's reflections. How to justify God for what happened in history. And probably Katja is very correct when she emphasized that this theology and thinking about that starts with the anger with God. And this was the reflection of Jewish and Christian theologians in the face of the Holocaust, and this comes to mind in the face of Gulag as well. Interesting, however, that these ultimate questions were not direct topics of most papers. So we spoke about this kind of we raised this kind of topics inevitably, of course. But we were discussing other subjects and other case studies. But the ultimate questions that Katja listed in the very beginning were looming behind anything we were talking about. In fact, we are finally stuck with these ultimate issues. I'm not a theologian, and I leave to the theologians to the direct treatment of such issues as the goodness of human nature, of the goodness of God. What is essential in our approach to the Gulag is that we use the tools of the various academic disciplines: history, historical and cultural anthropology, religious studies, literary criticism, and political science. Yet the object of this research is not something that we could let us avoiding the ultimate issues. Therefore, whatever our particular topic is, and we see in the program the variety of topics, of course, and whatever way that we can feel ourselves proud of being neutral academics, neutral and objective, so to speak. We inevitably stretch against the ultimate issues, the moral issues, and they are presented in the form of our moral reflections over the cases that we study. So I would say that this is how the contribution to the theology of Gulag is made. Through the issues, through the questions, so some kind of moral reflections, but that we inevitably raise while speaking about subjects that may not have direct relationship to that. So my task was to single out a few major themes, and the three major themes that we have covered, as far as I can perceive them, the topics of the conference are the issue of guilt, victimhood, suffering as historical and moral issues. This is the first focus. The second focus is the memory of the Soviet past in general. And the third one is Russian Orthodoxy's involvement in the memory work. And I will start with this first part, the first number of topics around guilt, victimhood, and suffering. As Alphonse Bruning, one of the participants of our conference, who is here, has made in spoke about the personal guilt and collective responsibility as a central issue. This is indeed a key moral issue. It looks like it is not easy sometimes even to locate those who are personally guilty, who are perpetrators. But also there are sympathizers who shared and endorsed the general legitimation of violence and such. For example, in terms of the Marxist-Leninist metaphysics of history that legitimized the violence. As Katharina von Kellenbach wrote in one of the papers that we also published on the website, when atrocity becomes legitimized violence, it is not perceived as evil when committed. And this is, by the way, the main mechanism that makes it so grandiose, and also this is what makes it so confused, the process of dehumanization that makes this grandiose violence possible. And this is what Agamben was analyzing, and what I guess Kati is going to speak about, the dehumanization tomorrow. And what about the passive observers and bystander, not resisting observers and bystanders? What about their collective guilt and responsibility? Of course, these are all the topics Hannah Arendt was reflecting upon. Also we go still further. Is the very fact of being a victim a clearing and purifying status? Evidently not. As Katharina von Kellenbach in our project wrote, to become a victim is not a badge of moral innocence. And vice versa, is the fact of not being a victim at all? Does this fact by itself imply suspicion of collaboration, suspicion of compromise and passivity? These reflections are common to Nazi and Soviet experience, yet in the case of Gulag, comparing to the Holocaust, this makes this question particularly confused, as Paige Herlinger, who is also here with us, has aptly remarked that the binary between the perpetrators and the victims in the Soviet case was much more fluid than in the Nazi case. And for that matter, in the case of the American slavery, as she put it, or apartheid in South Africa. So this confusion is a particular special thing in Gulag case that many agree upon. Arseny Roginsky, the founder of Memorial Society, emphasized that we must start all the reflections with one clear fact, to recognize one uncontested and clear truth, that the state regime as such was criminal, преступный, as he said, evil, and therefore guilty, responsible, not only for the massive deaths, but also for the ethical mess and confusion that pervasively penetrated into the entire body of society. But once again, this historical truth doesn't solve all the problems. One thing is to make this verdict to the state as inhuman and anti-human. In the same way, we can speak of all those innocent people in terms of massive collective victimhood suffered from the inhuman state. But when we are talking about the guilt of particular people and the sufferings of particular people, I think we should somehow introduce a very cautious, very fine, what I called a careful economy of guilt and victimhood based upon the careful examination of each single individual case. Another aspect, the work of post-memory, how we go through this, live through this past now. And that's another aspect of what we were talking about all the time since the beginning of the project. As Katharina von Kellenbach, whom I already mentioned, writes, both victims and perpetrators desperately wish to leave this ruinous past behind. But eventually, such piles of toxic debris must be dealt with, decontaminated, sorted, aerated, and transformed. The undigested legacy is transmitted to future generation. And this process of Vergangenheit, Bewältigung, as in the German case, didn't happen in Russia. The undigested legacy, is transmitted, is really still there, is left for the third and the fourth generation. How can we tune ourselves for dealing with this legacy, given the confusion I have just talked about? Paige Herlinger suggested, referring to Omer Bartov, that we might think of assuming our common humanity with the perpetrators. It's terribly hard. We can assume that the human nature is ambivalent, but it's really hard to associate ourselves with the possibility of evil in humanity and in ourselves, the original sin even, or Yetzer Hara and things like that. Also, we must be honest in this. It is one thing to discuss about moral choices right now in Amsterdam in 2018 when we are sitting here in this wonderful place, beautiful place. And it's a totally different thing to make moral choices where your life and the life of your loved ones are at stake. And so we must think about our parents, our ancestors, why they did what they did and why they didn't do what they didn't in this grand situation of moral choices under the pressure of the inhuman Leviathan, and how their victimhood and how their guilt is passed to ourselves and how it is digested in ourselves. Yelena Volkova, I'm not sure that she's here. She's not. Yeah, but she was a part of the previous meeting. Yelena Volkova analyzed the 4 words carved on the new wall of grief. Stena Skorbi, a monument in Moscow for the victims of political repressions, opened in the fall last year. 4 words. Помнить, знать, осудить, простить. Remember, know, condemn, and forgive. In principle, to my view, the formula is strong and clear. Yet Volkova reminds us that condemn, осудить, didn't mean any legal judgment in the Russian case so far. Also, there was no one case in the Soviet or post-Soviet history of a person who repented and asked for forgiveness, прощение. And in this sense, Denis Karagodin case in Tomsk, discussed at length by Frank Bestervoite, is, of course, an exceptional example of restorative justice. He contacted, as you know, the granddaughter of a person who murdered his grandfather. And this example, although set in the kind of post-memory context after 2 generations, is a great precedent. Now, the second big cluster of issues assessing the Soviet past in general. Solzhenitsyn was the first probably to prove that Gulag was the very essential and formative element of the Sovietness. Many emphasized that the formation of memory of the Soviet past, analyzing the current mythologies about the Soviet past, was central also to our project. The task of social sciences is to study how this memory is being formed now. What are the reasons and sources of the Soviet nostalgia, or Soviet repulsion, or this in post-Soviet Russia? What would be a balanced assessment of the Soviet period? As same Beglov and Tchaikovsky, whom I already mentioned, noted, one important argument of the Soviet nostalgia is the reference to order versus chaos. It's true that it was the super-ordered society, and the biological chaos is always a threat, and order is a cultural response to this threat. The question is, of course, what kind of order and how much it costs. And I think that we need a reflection about the fact that the order based upon indiscriminate violence is simply an inverted form of the biological chaos. However, by far the stronger argument is the victory over Nazism, the victory over a greater evil of Nazism. And this is certainly the foundation of Russia's current civil religion, if you can tell this. This historical and moral argument goes far beyond the cult of the dead. It also uses the sacrificial meaning of victory as a redemption of all the sufferings and guilt of the Stalinist terror. The evil of the Gulag is redeemed through the victory of a greater evil of Nazism. This is what makes the memory of the Soviet past quite confused in Russia, and the state policy toward the Soviet period is ambivalent, and so the mass perception as well. There are state initiatives quite cautious to recognize and condemn the Gulag. For example, the opening of the Garden of Memory in Butovo outside Moscow in last September, and the Wall of the Grief that I just showed, both mentioned by Wil van der Berken, who was here in the beginning but then left, unfortunately. But then Wil van der Berken shows that in these events, if we analyze what have been said at the opening of these memorials, may be seen as a kind of a subtle denial, not full truth. The president and the patriarch, while opening the wall, didn't mention abstract repressions without mentioning who exactly was behind them. So van der Berken makes a very important point. He writes, the national tragedy is presented as a kind of natural disaster, a devastating hurricane that swept over the country, or as an unavoidable fate that fell upon Russia from outside. And the key words here are, of course, natural disaster, this trope of natural disaster, and the idea that it comes from outside. We find similar forms of ambivalence in the local cases, such the one studied by Jean-Marie Rouillet, Willoughby, at a small holy spring in Lozhok in western Siberia, outside Novosibirsk. The spring is said to be linked to the memory of Gulag victims, and yet the local public mostly share pro-Soviet and pro-Stalinist nostalgia. And at the opening, nothing was said about, Stalin was not mentioned, nobody was mentioned, no concrete names. So that also a kind of a subtle denial. And Olga Sedakova referred to the current state's inability to properly commemorate the Gulag victims because of the same ambivalence towards the Soviet past. It looks like, for many reasons, there are some layers of silencing that envelop, if not the denial, not the direct denial, but the layers of silencing that envelop the whole thing, the memory of the Gulag. And so our task in both research and civic action is probably to remove these layers of silencing one after another. Now, the last point and the last cluster of topics relates to the Russian Orthodoxy work of memory. So I agree with Vera Shevtsov, who said in a previous meeting that everything the Russian Orthodox Church was doing intellectually since the end of the Soviet Union in the final analysis is the response to the Soviet past and to the Gulag. And Vera also went on by stressing this. In today's context, there are two versions of memory work in the Russian Orthodox Church, one for outsiders and one for outsiders within the church as an institution and community, and another one for the outsiders, for the rest of society, for the secular society. In the internal version, the theological work in its classical sense has not been much developed since the end of the Soviet Union. There was no theological negotiation with the past, except for some very small exceptions, but no real attempt to verbalize theologically the same ultimate issues. And but I find very true, by the way, the intuition of Beglov and Chukovskaya that the development of the 20th century Orthodox theology, the famous neo-patristic synthesis and other development were in fact a reaction to the anthropological crisis of the 20th century, definite turn of the value to the value of individual, to the human person, amid the frightening totalitarian trends. Yet, these theological reflections of the 20th century thinkers were not further developed right now. So, but there are two other modes of religious expression other than theological logos, and these were central to the Russian Church: hagiography and liturgy. Hagiography and liturgy. And in these two spheres, there was the work of memory. The work of memory is being done. First, the major work of canonization of the new martyrs, Novomucheniki, started in the 1990s. In terms of liturgy, there were some kind of elements that have been introduced, like the communion of new собор новомучеников и исповедников Церкви Русской, the communion of new martyrs and confessions of the Russian Church on February 7th each year, day of commemoration of the Sabor of the New Martyrs suffered in Butovo, Tsar's Days in Yekaterinburg in July, each July actually, and then some other local initiatives like in Solovki that Susanna Bogomil, who is here, reminded me as well. The special days of commemoration of the victims, Novomucheniki or new martyrs dead in Solovki, and also the act of national repentance by Transfiguration Brotherhood in Moscow, described by Nadezhda Kitsenko in one of our meetings. And this brotherhood, by the way, the Transfiguration Brotherhood is a very special of course, very special community within the Russian church, and draws the chain of national repentance from the early 20th century national praise as a response to Russian Revolution. So, and this is like a continuation of this national repentance practice. Olga Sidakova reminds that commemoration of the dead is one of the deepest traditions in the Russian Orthodoxy, and she calls Отпевание и Панихида, the memorial services, central rites of the Russian Christian tradition. And she then refers to a new secular ritual, so to speak, that the return of the names, возвращение имен, at Lubyanka Square in Moscow, when people make a line and name some of the victims murdered in Moscow, the Muscovites. And this is every year on October 29th. And that reminds what Katya was saying about, referring to Akhmatova's, хотелось бы всех поименно назвать, to name everybody, each victim by name, and that how this new secular initiative is going on. So it's a kind of a functional analog, possibly a secular substitution to the Christian panichida, the prayer for the dead. But there is an important point. The secular and Christian initiative are sometimes not easily compatible, not easily translated into each other. And there are some conflicts of interpretation between the secular and, so that's, what's the reason of it? And the reason is, of course, the ambivalent assessment of the Soviet period by the church itself, by the church leadership. And that's also this ambivalence that remembers the subtle denial kind of that referred by van der Berken. When the evil becomes anonymous, it also becomes metaphysical, meta-individual, and the perpetrators disappear. The guilt is muffled, the main mechanism of avoiding direct reflectivity of this. So the Vergangenheit, Bewältigung, doesn't work in this case. Also, it looks like the church shares the views that makes the victory over Nazism a historical and moral argument of counterbalancing the terror. Although, at one point, the patriarch called the 1917 revolution a catastrophe, and the Soviet experience in general a catastrophe. But at the same time, there is a kind of a balancing approach from the church leadership, counterbalancing the terror with the victory, and again referring to this the redemptive cost of victory. And also, there is this argument, another argument, presenting revolution as Soviet period as a whole as expressing the deep and actually evangelical value of solidarity and the quest for social justice, the ideal brotherhood in Christ, kind of another trope, the evangelical trope that is used to somehow legitimize the Soviet experience. So we have very ambivalent assessments, and besides the church official assessment, we see also another type of orthodox work of memory, a type of vernacular popular theologies, a sort of spontaneous narratives that express the perception of the past catastrophes and traumas, and such of some ideas slip to a banal conspiracy theory. The Bolsheviks as a conspiracy of the godless secular West against the true Christian empire, or in a most complex way, yes, we have our own sins, but the sin of being seduced. The sin of being seduced by the Antichrist of Western secularism. In both cases, the source of catastrophe is located outside, of course. And then a more sophisticated popular theodicy, the idea that God had providential the providential plan of purification through suffering, the revolution being a sort of flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, Bich Boží. Such a divine plan punishes the collective sin, but finally makes the Orthodox faith purified, and thus reinforced the purely Orthodox nation, the words katechon, the pillar of power of spiritual resistance to the corruption of the modern post-Christian era. Overall, the vernacular theologies might seem lacking real theological status, but they should be studied, nevertheless, as a part of the cultural work of memory. And the new martyrs, the big issue is, of course, who deserves commemoration as saints. Okay. And here, again, Begloff and Chukovsky refer to they try to build such an ecclesiastic understanding of the deed of the new martyrs and confessors of Russia, which would be consistent with the modern scientific understanding of the nature of the Soviet regime and its repressive policies. And that's the big question of inclusivity or exclusivity. Whom can we venerate as saints, and whom can we commemorate as victims? Only those who are baptized Orthodox, or only those who suffered for Christ, and what does it mean? And there are all kinds of interesting developments and all kinds of interesting suggestions that you can find on that matter in at the website when you go over the papers. Finally, I come with a kind of a typology of possible ways of defining this exclusive, solving this question of and inclusivity of commemoration and canonization. The first possibility is commemorate those victims who were baptized Orthodox and venerate priests proven as dead for their faith. The second option, to commemorate only baptized Orthodox and venerate those among them who were proven as dead for their faith, no matter priest or layperson. The third is to commemorate, venerate all the victims who morally merited this, no matter baptism in Orthodoxy. And the final, commemorate all innocent victims, no matter baptism, no matter moral merit, because the merit in this case is practically impossible to calculate. The last point that was used by the argument was used by the Armenian Church, by the way, when they canonized all the victims. Yeah, but it doesn't work in this case because in that case it was the ethnic criteria of ethnic identity that was central. So. Concluding, for further work, I don't have time to elaborate, but I just list some directions of further work. We need to think about the global dimension of violence of the 20th century, and to see how Gulag is connected to other instances of mass violence. To see the national roots of Gulag, not avoiding essentializing, but trying to figure out what are the national prerequisites and reasons the Gulag happened in Russia. And the memory work and oblivion as affecting the society today is a big issue that we need to continue to work on. And also the multiple experience of ethnic, confessional, and social groups and subcultures within Gulag, because we really can speak about multiple experiences that are very different in each particular ethnic, confessional, or subcultural case. Thank you very much.